The security footage showed something that made Vivienne Kellerman's blood run cold. 2:47 a.m. A black man in gray coveralls sat at a restricted terminal in the R&D wing, fingers moving across the keyboard with a fluency that didn't belong to someone who pushed a mop for a living. The angle captured his profile: concentrated, methodical, utterly confident. Then he plugged in a USB drive and began downloading files. Viv's hand hovered over her phone, ready to dial security, ready to do what any responsible CEO would do when faced with clear evidence of corporate espionage. But something stopped her. A memory unwanted and sharp surfaced from 12 years ago. She'd been a junior analyst at a firm that no longer existed. 26 years old, hungry to prove herself, working 80-hour weeks on a presentation that caught the CEO's attention. Her supervisor, Gregory Hollis, had smiled at her in meetings, called her kiddo, took her under his wing. 2 weeks before her promotion was announced, Gregory went to HR with documentation, emails he'd fabricated, drafts he'd backdated, claiming Viv had stolen his work. She was escorted from the building before she could say a word in her defense. The investigation took 3 months. 3 months of her reputation bleeding out while Gregory continued attending meetings, accepting praise for ideas that were never his. 3 months of colleagues who'd smiled at her in hallways, suddenly unable to meet her eyes. She was eventually cleared. Gregory was fired. But Viv never forgot what those 3 months taught her. The system doesn't wait for truth, it reacts to suspicion. And once suspicion attaches to your name, it leaves a stain that never fully washes out. She'd sworn then that she would never do to someone else what Gregory Hollis had done to her. Never condemn without evidence, never assume guilt based on appearance or circumstance, never make someone else feel the way she'd felt in that HR conference room, watching her career die while a man who looked trustworthy told lies about her. Viv pulled her hand back from the phone. She looked at the frozen image on her screen. The janitor caught in the act. Every instinct she'd developed in 2 decades of corporate survival told her what this was. But instincts had been wrong before. Hers had been wrong about Gregory Hollis. She'd trusted him, considered him a mentor right up until the moment he tried to destroy her. She needed more information. She needed to understand what this man was actually doing before she made a decision that could ruin his life. Viv closed the security feed and pulled up his personnel file. Silas Booker, 42 years old, hired 18 months ago through a temp agency. No criminal record, no red flags. Just a standard background check that showed exactly what you'd expect from a night janitor. Previous jobs in maintenance and cleaning, a GED, an address in Ashland Heights, one of the poorer neighborhoods on Chicago's west side. Nothing unusual. Nothing that explained how a man who cleaned toilets for a living could navigate a restricted computer system like he'd built it himself. She dug deeper, running his social security number through every database she had access to. The results came back thin, too thin. It was as if Silas Booker had barely existed before 18 months ago. Bank records showed sporadic employment, addresses that changed frequently, long gaps in the work history, a ghost who'd only materialized when Cortec Dynamics hired him to empty trash cans. Viv checked the time, 3:42 a.m. She'd been at this for an hour. Her coffee had gone cold. Outside her office windows, Chicago's skyline glittered against the darkness, 1,000 lit windows marking other insomniacs grinding through the night. She was supposed to be reviewing security protocols for Project Titan, the $50 million platform launch scheduled for 72 hours from now. Instead, she was chasing ghosts through personnel databases, trying to understand why a janitor coded like an architect. That's when she made her decision. Tomorrow night, when Silas Booker finished his shift and walked out of Cortec, Vivienne Kellerman was going to follow him. The next morning arrived with the chaos Viv had come to expect. The conference room on the 32nd floor was filled with tension thick enough to taste. Project Titan's final review meeting had devolved into barely concealed panic as the engineering team presented their progress report, or rather, their lack of it. Viv sat at the head of the table, her expression neutral, as Tobias Mercer, the lead systems architect, explained why certain security protocols still weren't functioning properly. His voice was tight, professional panic seeping through the practiced calm. The core architecture has some legacy issues we're still working through. The original foundation was built on a framework that's complicated. We're confident we can resolve it before launch, but you've been confident for 3 weeks. Viv's interruption was calm, almost gentle. And we launch in 72 hours. Tobias's face flushed. We're doing everything we can. Viv studied him for a moment. Tobias was competent, genuinely competent, but he was also clearly out of his depth. The way he kept referring to the original foundation and legacy framework suggested he was wrestling with something he didn't fully understand, like a mechanic trying to repair an engine without the manual. The door opened and Clayton Barrett walked in. At 55, Cortex CFO carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. Silver-haired and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Silas Booker made in 3 months, Clayton had been with Cortex since before Viv was hired. He'd supported her promotion to CEO 3 years ago, a fact he reminded her of whenever he wanted something. Vivienne. His voice was warm, paternal, the kind of tone that made people instinctively trust him. I heard we're having some technical difficulties, nothing the team can't handle. Viv's eyes stayed on Tobias. Clayton smiled the way he always did, reassuring, slightly condescending, like a father watching his daughter struggle with homework he could solve in seconds. I'm sure, but if we need to discuss contingency options, my door is always open. He glanced around the room. We've overcome bigger challenges than this. The meeting continued for another hour, but Viv's mind kept drifting back to the security footage. To Silas Booker, typing in the dark like he owned the place. When the meeting finally ended, Clayton lingered as the others filed out. You seemed distracted. It wasn't quite a question. Viv weighed her words carefully. I noticed something odd in the security feeds last night. One of the cleaning staff was in a restricted area after hours. Something flickered behind Clayton's eyes, so brief Viv almost missed it. Which staff member? The janitor, Silas Booker. The flicker again, barely perceptible. Ah, Clayton nodded slowly. I'd recommend reporting it to security immediately. These things have a way of escalating if left unchecked. I want to look into it myself first, make sure I understand what I'm seeing before I make any accusations. Clayton's smile returned, but it was tighter now. Vivienne, I appreciate your thoroughness. I do. But we're 72 hours from the biggest launch in company history. You don't have time to play detective with a janitor who's probably stealing office supplies. Probably. Viv let the word hang between them. You know how these things usually go. Clayton stood, straightening his jacket. People like that. They see an opportunity, they take it. It's not complicated. People like that. The phrase settled into Viv's chest like a stone. She thought about what she'd seen on the footage. The way Silas moved through the system, the precision, the familiarity. That wasn't someone stealing office supplies, that was someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. I'll handle it my way. Her voice was firm but not confrontational. Clayton's smile didn't waver, but his eyes cooled by several degrees. Of course. You're the CEO. He walked toward the door, then stopped. Just remember, when things go wrong, it's your name on the line, not the janitor's. He left without waiting for a response. Viv sat alone in the empty conference room, Clayton's words echoing in her mind. People like that. She'd heard that phrase before, in different contexts, from different mouths. It was the kind of phrase that pretended to be about behavior while actually being about something else entirely. She thought about Silas Booker, a black man who kept his head down, who cleaned floors and emptied trash and made himself invisible. A man who, according to every assumption Clayton was making, couldn't possibly be anything other than what he appeared to be. But Viv had seen the footage. She'd seen his hands on that keyboard. Whatever Silas Booker was, he wasn't what he appeared to be. And tonight, she was going to find out the truth. The clock on Viv's dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when Silas Booker finally emerged from the Cortec building. She watched him cross the parking lot from her Mercedes, parked 3 rows back in the shadow of a delivery truck. He moved differently out here than he did inside. His shoulders weren't quite as hunched, his gaze not quite as fixed on the ground. He was still careful, still quiet, but there was something almost human about the way he adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and looked up at the sky for a brief moment before heading toward the bus stop. Viv waited until he boarded the number 47 bus before pulling out of her parking spot. Following a bus through Chicago at midnight was easier than she'd expected. The streets were mostly empty and the bus made frequent stops, giving her plenty of time to hang back without losing sight of it. She felt ridiculous. A CEO in a $70,000 car tailing a janitor like some amateur private investigator. But she'd committed to this course of action, and Vivienne Kellerman never abandoned a course of action once she'd committed. The bus wound through increasingly unfamiliar territory. The gleaming office towers of downtown gave way to strip malls and fast food restaurants, which in turn gave way to narrow streets lined with check-cashing stores and laundromats with bars on their windows. Viv had lived in Chicago for 15 years and had never been to this part of it. The GPS on her dashboard marked the neighborhood as Ashland Heights, but the name on the screen bore no relationship to the reality unfolding through her windshield. Boarded-up houses, graffiti-tagged walls, streetlights that flickered or didn't work at all. Silas got off at a stop in front of a church with a collapsed steeple. Viv pulled over half a block back and watched him walk down Liberty Street, past a row of abandoned storefronts until he reached a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign over the door. Liberty Street Community Hub. The paint was faded, the letters chipped, but someone had clearly put effort into making the place look welcoming. Children's drawings were taped to the windows, rockets and robots and stick figures holding hands under rainbows. A banner above the door announced free coding classes, Tuesday and Thursday nights, all ages welcome. Viv sat in her car, engine idling, watching Silas disappear through the front door. Coding classes. The janitor who could navigate restricted computer systems was teaching coding classes in a community center that looked like it might collapse in a strong wind. She should leave. She'd seen enough to know that Silas Booker wasn't selling Cortec secrets to a competitor. Whatever he was doing with those files, it wasn't corporate espionage. But the question remained, what was he doing? Before she could talk herself out of it, Viv was out of the car and walking toward the building. The inside of Liberty Street Community Hub smelled like old books and industrial cleaner. The walls were covered with motivational posters and more children's artwork, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the particular frequency of fixtures that hadn't been replaced in decades. Viv had prepared a cover story. She was a potential donor interested in supporting local education initiatives, but the elderly woman at the front desk barely looked up from her crossword puzzle before waving her toward the back room. "Computer class is through there. Mr. Silas just started. You can watch from the back if you want." Viv thanked her and walked down a narrow hallway, past a storage closet and a bathroom with an out-of-order sign, until she reached a room at the end. She stopped in the doorway. Silas Booker stood at the front of the room, facing a group of about 15 children. They ranged in age from maybe 7 to 14, a mix of black and brown faces clustered around ancient desktop computers that looked like they belonged in a museum. Silas was explaining something about variables and loops, his voice patient and warm in a way that made Viv's chest tighten. This was not the man she'd watched on security footage. That man had been quick, efficient, almost mechanical in his movements. This man smiled. This man crouched down next to a little boy who was struggling and guided his hands on the keyboard with the gentleness of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Remember what I told you. The computer only does exactly what you tell it to do. So if something goes wrong, it's not because the computer is broken, it's because we need to be more specific about what we want. A girl in the front row raised her hand. But Mr. Silas, what if I don't know what I want? Silas considered the question seriously, as if it were the most important thing anyone had asked him all day. Then you experiment. You try one thing, and if it doesn't work, you try another thing. That's what coding really is. It's just trying things until something works. And you know what? Life is pretty much the same way. Viv watched him move through the room, checking on each student, offering encouragement and corrections in equal measure. He knew every child's name. He knew their projects, their struggles, their small victories. When one boy finally got his program to run correctly and the screen filled with colorful shapes, Silas's face broke into a smile so genuine it hurt to look at. This was not a thief. This was not a corporate spy. This was a teacher. But that still didn't explain how a night janitor had the skills to teach children to code, or why he was using core tech equipment after hours to download files. Viv was so absorbed in watching Silas that she almost didn't notice the girl who had slipped into the room from a side door. She was about 11, with braided hair and glasses that were slightly too big for her face. She carried a worn school bag covered in patches and pins, and she made her way to an empty seat in the corner with the practiced silence of someone who didn't want to interrupt. But as she passed Silas, she reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. "Hey, baby girl." Silas's voice softened even further. "Homework done?" "All of it," the girl whispered back. "Even the extra credit." "That's my June." June. His daughter. The girl from the personnel file. Viv had noticed a dependent listed but hadn't thought much about it at the time. Now, watching Silas return to his lesson while stealing glances at his daughter settling into her seat, Viv understood something she hadn't before. This wasn't just a man teaching coding classes. This was a father trying to give his child a different future. Viv left before the class ended. She sat in her Mercedes for a long time, staring at the peeling sign above the community center door, trying to reconcile what she'd just witnessed with what she'd seen on the security footage. Silas Booker could code, not just basic skills, the way he'd explained concepts to those children. The natural fluency of his instruction spoke to years of professional experience. He wasn't someone who'd picked up programming as a hobby. He was someone who had lived and breathed it, which meant the question wasn't whether Silas had the skills to access Cortex systems. He clearly did. The question was why a man with those skills was mopping floors for $12 an hour. Viv pulled out her phone and began to dig. The Cortex archives were supposed to be accessible only to senior executives, but Viv had never seen anyone actually use them. The company was only 12 years old, and most of its history was still alive in the memories of people who worked there. But Viv needed to go back further than memory. She needed to go back 5 years. The search took her most of the night. She sat in her home office, surrounded by the expensive minimalist furniture she'd chosen to project success, scrolling through personnel records and project documentation and internal communications that should have been purged years ago but had somehow survived in forgotten backup folders. At 3:42 a.m., she found it, a personnel file. Not the thin recent one for Silas Booker, the janitor, but an older file buried in an archived directory labeled terminated_employees_year_7. Silas James Booker, Senior System Architect, Employee ID 4729. Viv stared at the screen, her tired eyes struggling to process what she was seeing. The photograph in the file showed a different man. Not physically, the face was the same, but everything else had changed. The Silas in this photo wore a tailored shirt and a confident smile. His shoulders were squared, his gaze direct. He looked like someone who belonged in a corner office, not pushing a mop through empty hallways at midnight. According to the file, Silas had been hired 8 years ago as a mid-level engineer. Within 2 years, he'd been promoted to senior system architect, one of the most critical positions in the company. His performance reviews were glowing: exceptional technical vision, invaluable asset to the team, instrumental in developing core infrastructure. Core infrastructure. Viv's hands trembled slightly as she navigated to the technical documentation from that period. The original architecture of Cortex's primary platform, the same platform that Project Titan was built upon, had been designed by a small team of engineers, and the lead architect on that team, the person credited with creating the foundational framework that everything else depended on, was Silas Booker. Tobias Mercer's words from the meeting echoed in her mind. The original foundation was built on a framework that's complicated. Complicated because the person who'd built it was no longer there to explain it. But why? Why would Cortex let go of someone so valuable? Viv found the termination record buried in a separate folder. Terminated for cause. Violation of confidentiality agreements. Unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information to external parties. The words were clinical, final. They painted a picture of a man who had betrayed his company's trust, exactly the kind of person who might return years later as a janitor to finish what he'd started. Except Viv had learned 12 years ago, in an HR conference room, that termination records could lie. She kept digging. The email was in a folder marked for deletion but never actually erased. A digital ghost preserved by the kind of bureaucratic oversight that Viv usually found infuriating but was now profoundly grateful for. It was dated 5 years and 3 months ago. The sender was Silas Booker. The recipient was Clayton Barrett. Viv read it once, then again, then a third time, each reading making her feel more sick than the last. The email was a formal whistleblower complaint. Silas had discovered that Cortex leadership, specifically a group of executives that included Clayton, had been secretly selling user data to third-party advertisers. Not anonymized data, not aggregated statistics. Actual user information, including names, locations, and browsing histories sold to the highest bidder in direct violation of the company's privacy policy and multiple federal regulations. Silas had documented everything. Transaction records, email chains between executives and buyers. A paper trail so damning it could have destroyed Cortex entirely if it had ever reached regulators or the press. He'd sent it to Clayton because Clayton was the CFO, the person theoretically responsible for ensuring the company operated within legal and ethical boundaries. He'd trusted the system to do what it was supposed to do. 2 weeks after sending that email, Silas Booker was terminated for unauthorized disclosure of proprietary information. Viv sat back in her chair, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Silas hadn't leaked company secrets. He'd tried to report a crime, and Clayton, who had smiled at her in meetings and called her Vivienne in that warm paternal voice, had destroyed him for it. She thought about what she'd seen at the community center. The faded Cortex logo in the corner of Silas's teaching materials, old presentations probably from his days as a real employee, the way he'd looked at his daughter, the weariness in his voice when he'd talked about life being about trying things until something works. 5 years ago, Silas Booker had been a respected engineer with a promising career. He'd done the right thing, reported wrongdoing through the proper channels, trusted that the system would protect him. And the system had chewed him up and spit him out. Viv thought about Clayton's words from the meeting. People like that, they see an opportunity, they take it. He hadn't been talking about janitors or thieves, he'd been talking about a man he'd personally destroyed. A man whose life he'd ruined to protect his own secrets, and he'd said it with a smile, confident that Viv would never look deeper, never question the narrative he'd constructed. She'd almost proven him right. The sun was rising over Chicago's skyline when Viv finally closed her laptop. She hadn't slept. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she knew what she had to do. Silas Booker had tried to do the right thing 5 years ago, and it had cost him everything. Now he was back, moving through Cortex systems in the dark. And Viv needed to understand why. Not to stop him, not to report him, to help him finish what he'd started. The next morning, Viv arrived at Cortex to find Clayton already in her office. He stood by the windows, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low tones that cut off the moment she entered. His smile appeared instantly, practiced and warm. "Morning, Vivienne. I was just checking in with the board about Titan. They're getting nervous." Viv set her briefcase down, buying herself a moment to arrange her expression into something neutral. She'd spent the hours since sunrise deciding how to play this. Clayton couldn't know what she'd discovered. Not yet. Not until she understood Silas's endgame. "I'm meeting with Tobias this afternoon. We'll have a clearer picture then." Clayton's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "And that security issue? The janitor?" The question landed like a test. Viv met his eyes, her voice steady. "I'm handling it. I hope that means you reported it." Clayton moved away from the window, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. "These things have a way of spiraling if you wait too long. A man in a restricted area after hours? That's not ambiguous, Vivienne. That's a threat. I said I'm handling it." The firmness in Viv's tone surprised even her. Something shifted in Clayton's expression, a calculation happening behind the paternal concern. "Of course. You're the CEO. Just remember what I said yesterday. When this goes sideways, it's your name the board will remember." He left without waiting for a response, but his words hung in the air like smoke. Viv sank into her chair, her hands shaking slightly. She'd just lied to her CFO, her mentor, the man who'd championed her promotion. Except he wasn't any of those things. He was the man who'd destroyed Silas Booker for telling the truth. And now he was using the same coded language. People like that, when this goes sideways, trying to manipulate her into becoming complicit in another cover-up. Viv pulled up the security footage from last night, watching Silas move through the building with ghost-like efficiency. Whatever he was doing, he'd been doing it for weeks. Methodical, planned, not theft, something else. She needed to talk to him, not as a CEO investigating a threat, as someone who understood what it meant to be destroyed by people who smiled while they lied. The evening crept toward midnight with agonizing slowness. Viv cleared her schedule, claimed a migraine, and drove to Ashland Heights 2 hours before Silas's class was scheduled to start. The Mercedes felt obscene on these streets, gleaming against the cracked pavement and graffiti-tagged walls. She parked a block from Liberty Street Community Hub and waited. At 8:47 p.m., she watched parents drop off their children. Mothers in work uniforms, fathers who looked bone-tired, a grandmother holding a little boy's hand. They greeted each other with familiarity born of shared struggle, their voices carrying warmth that corporate networking events could never replicate. By 9 o'clock, 15 children had filed into the building, and Viv could see Silas through the window, setting up computers, his movements efficient and careful. She waited until 9:30, until the class was well underway, before approaching the building. The elderly receptionist, the same woman from before, glanced up from her crossword puzzle. "Back again? You thinking about donating?" Viv hadn't prepared for direct questions. "Maybe. I wanted to see more of the program first." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, assessing. "We don't get a lot of white ladies in Mercedes around here. Most donors send checks and never visit." Her voice wasn't hostile, just factual. "I prefer to understand what I'm supporting." The woman nodded slowly. Class ends at 10. Mr. Silas usually stays late, cleaning up, grading homework. You can talk to him then. She returned to her puzzle, dismissing Viv without further ceremony. Viv retreated to her car and waited. The hour crawled by. At 10:15, parents began arriving to collect their children. By 10:30, the building was dark except for a single light in the back room. Viv checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Professional but not intimidating, she hoped, and walked toward the community center for the second time. The receptionist was gone. The hallway lights were dimmed. Viv made her way toward the back room, her heels clicking too loudly against the linoleum floor. The door was ajar, and through it she could see Silas at a battered desk, grading papers under a single lamp. He looked up as her shadow fell across the doorway. I wondered when you'd show up. His voice was calm, unsurprised. Viv's carefully prepared opening statement evaporated. You knew I was following you? Silas leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that revealed nothing. Lady, you drive a $70,000 Mercedes SL through Ashland Heights. You think nobody noticed? He shook his head slowly, something that might have been amusement flickering across his face. Besides, I've been watching the security feeds too. Saw someone accessing my old personnel file at 3 in the morning. Wasn't hard to figure out who. The casual revelation left Viv off balance. She'd thought she was investigating him. He'd been investigating her right back. Can I sit down? Silas gestured toward a folding chair across from his desk. It was plastic, clearly designed for children, and wobbled when Viv lowered herself into it. The power dynamic shifted immediately. Her in the child's seat, him behind the desk, both of them aware of the absurdity and significance. I know who you are. Viv decided directness was her only option. I know what you were, and I know what they did to you. Silas's expression didn't change, but something hardened in his eyes. Then you know more than most people. What do you want, Miss Kellerman? Project Titan is failing. Viv forced herself to hold his gaze. There's a critical flaw in the core architecture, the architecture you designed. My entire engineering team has been trying to fix it, but they don't understand the system well enough. We're 48 hours from launch, and if we can't solve this problem, the company loses everything. And you want me to help? It wasn't a question. There was no surprise in his voice, only a kind of weary recognition. Yes, Silas laughed, but the sound held no humor. You want me to save the company that destroyed my life? The company that blacklisted me from the entire industry? That made it so I couldn't get a job anywhere. Not as an engineer, not as a consultant, not even as a help desk technician. You want me to help them? I want you to help me. Viv leaned forward, the cheap chair creaking beneath her. It's not the same thing. The hell it isn't. No, Viv's voice was firm. I know what Clayton Barrett did to you. I found the email, the whistleblower complaint you sent 5 years ago. I know you tried to do the right thing, and I know he buried you for it. She paused, letting that sink in. And I know that right now he's trying to delay the launch so he can blame the technical team and walk away clean, just like he walked away clean after what he did to you. Silas's jaw tightened, the only sign that her words had landed. And what about you, Ms. Kellerman? What's your angle in all this? If Titan fails, Clayton wins. Viv chose her words carefully. He gets to restructure the company, push out the people he doesn't control, and keep protecting the same corrupt system that was selling user data 5 years ago. But if Titan launches successfully, if we fix this problem and prove that the company can function without his influence, then I have leverage. I can push for a real investigation. I can expose what he did. And what about me? Silas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. What do I get out of this? Another chance to be chewed up and spit out by a system that was designed to crush people like me? The question hung between them, sharp and unanswerable. Viv thought about her prepared arguments, appeals to justice, promises of restoration, offers of compensation. They all felt hollow now, sitting in this cramped office in a community center held together by good intentions and duct tape. I can't change what happened. The admission felt like stepping off a ledge. I can't give you back 5 years of your life, or the nights your daughter spent wondering why everything changed, or the marriage that fell apart. I can't undo any of it. She met his eyes. But I can make sure it doesn't stay buried. I can make sure the people who hurt you face consequences. And I can make sure that when this story comes out, and it will come out, you're not remembered as the man who leaked company secrets. You're remembered as the man who tried to stop something wrong. Silas stared at her for a long moment. Behind him, the lamp flickered slightly, casting shadows across his face. You know what the hardest part was? It wasn't losing my job. It wasn't even losing my wife, though that came close. The hardest part was watching my daughter try to understand why everything changed. She was 6 years old when I got fired. 6. She didn't know what a whistleblower was. She didn't know what corporate retaliation meant. All she knew was that one day her daddy worked in a big fancy building, and the next day he was cleaning toilets and we were living in a car. His voice cracked slightly on the last word and he looked away. I spent 2 months in that car. 2 months of June asking me when we were going home. 2 months of telling her that everything was going to be okay while I had no idea if it actually would be. After that, I took whatever work I could find. Warehouse jobs, construction cleanup, night shifts at a grocery store. Anything that didn't require a background check that would show what Cortec had written about me. Viv felt something crack in her chest. She thought about her own life. Her corner office, her expensive car, her apartment with a view of Chicago's skyline. She'd worked hard for those things, built them from nothing, survived her own betrayal and clawed her way back. But she'd never had to do it with a child depending on her. She'd never had to explain to a 6-year-old why the world was unfair. I'm sorry. The words felt inadequate, a band-aid on a bullet wound. I don't want your apology. Silas turned back to face her, his expression hardening. I want to know what you're going to do when this is over. Are you going to go back to your corner office and pretend you never saw any of this? Or are you actually going to change something? The question demanded honesty, and Viv found herself giving it. I don't know. I'd like to say yes. I'd like to promise you that I'm going to tear down the whole system and rebuild it from scratch. But I'm not going to lie to you. I don't know what I can actually do. I only know what I'm willing to try. Silas studied her face for a long time, searching for something. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him. That's the first honest thing anyone from that company has ever said to me. The door to the office creaked open and a small figure appeared in the doorway. Juniper Booker stood there in pajamas, rubbing her eyes. She looked at Viv with the weary curiosity of a child who had learned not to trust strangers. Daddy, who's that? Silas's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The weariness and bitterness fell away, replaced by something soothed and protective. Nobody, baby girl, just someone from work. Go back to sleep. Juniper didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on Viv, assessing. Is she going to make trouble for us? The question hit Viv like a physical blow. This 11-year-old girl had already learned to assume the worst from people who looked like her. She'd already learned that strangers showing up at night usually meant something bad was coming. Number. Viv spoke directly to Juniper for the first time. I'm not going to make trouble. I'm trying to fix something that should have been fixed a long time ago. Juniper looked at her father. Something passed between them, a silent conversation that Viv couldn't interpret. Then Silas reached out and squeezed his daughter's hand. Go to bed, June. We'll talk in the morning. Juniper hesitated, then nodded and disappeared back through the door. Viv heard her footsteps padding down the hallway, followed by the creak of a mattress. When Silas spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. If I do this, if I help you, I need you to understand something. I'm not doing it for Cortec. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because my daughter deserves to see that doing the right thing doesn't always end in destruction. I need her to believe that the world can be fair even if I'm not sure I believe it myself anymore. Viv nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak. 48 hours? Silas's voice was stronger now, more certain. Can you fix the system in 48 hours? Silas looked at her with something that might have been the ghost of the confident man in that old personnel photo. I built that system from nothing in 18 months. I can fix one vulnerability in 48 hours. He stood up, grabbing his worn backpack from beside the desk. But I'm going to need access to the development servers. Real access, not the janitor back doors I've been using. I can arrange that, and I'm going to need everyone else out of the room. I work better alone, and I don't need Tobias Mercer looking over my shoulder, trying to understand code he'll never fully grasp. Done. And I'm going to need Clayton Barrett to not know I'm there until it's too late for him to stop me. Viv thought about Clayton, his smooth voice, his confident smile, his absolute certainty that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage. Leave Clayton to me. The next morning arrived with a fresh wave of panic. Viv reached Cortec at 7 a.m. to find Tobias Mercer in the main floor development area, surrounded by junior engineers who looked like they hadn't slept. His laptop screen displayed lines of code that made no sense. Error messages cascading in red. What happened? Viv's voice cut through the chaos. Tobias looked up, his face pale and drawn. The security framework. There's a catastrophic vulnerability in the core architecture. We ran the final stress tests last night and... He stopped, running a hand through his hair. If we launch Titan like this, the entire system can be bypassed within hours. Everything we've built, all the security protocols, the encryption, worthless if we can't fix this. How long to fix it? Tobias shook his head helplessly. We don't know. The problem is in the foundational code, the stuff that was written years ago. None of us really understand how it works. We've been building on top of it, but the actual architecture... His voice trailed off into frustrated silence. The person who originally designed it. You need them. We would, yes. But that person... Tobias stopped abruptly, seeming to catch himself. Isn't here anymore. Viv finished the sentence for him. I know. Before Tobias could respond, Clayton appeared from the executive corridor. His usually immaculate appearance showed cracks, his tie slightly askew, shadows under his eyes. He was on his phone, speaking in urgent tones that cut off when he saw Viv. We need to discuss contingency plans. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge of desperation beneath it. I've spoken with the board. They're prepared to authorize a delay if necessary. A delay means losing our market position. Viv kept her voice level. We've been promising this launch for months. Our competitors are already... Better a delay than a disaster. Clayton moved closer, lowering his voice. These things happen, Vivienne. We can blame the technical team, restructure, try again in 6 months. Blame the technical team. Let Tobias and his engineers take the fall for a problem rooted in decisions made years before they were hired. Protect the real source of the dysfunction. The fact that the company had driven out the one person who understood the system. And let Clayton once again walk away clean. I need 24 hours. The words came out before Viv had fully formed the plan. Clayton frowned. For what? To find another solution. Vivienne. His tone shifted to patient concern, the one he used when he thought she was being naive. There is no other solution. The only person who could fix this is someone who understands the original architecture, and that person—" He stopped, catching himself. "Is who?" Viv pressed. "No one. That person is no one." Clayton's recovery was smooth, but Viv had seen the flicker of panic in his eyes. "Look, I appreciate your optimism, but we're out of options. The responsible thing—" "I have an option." Viv cut him off. "Give me 24 hours. If I can't solve it, we'll discuss the delay then." Clayton studied her face, calculation happening behind his concerned expression. "What are you planning? Trust me." The phrase was deliberately chosen, thrown back at him like all the times he'd asked her to trust his judgment. For a long moment, Clayton said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. 24 hours. "But when this doesn't work, Vivienne, we do it my way." He walked away, phone already back at his ear. Viv watched him go, then turned to Tobias. "Clear the development room. I need it empty by 6 p.m. tonight." Tobias blinked. "Empty? But we're in the middle of—" "I know. Just do it. And give me administrative access to all the servers." "Ms. Kellerman, I don't understand." "You will." Viv pulled out her phone, scrolling to find the number she'd saved last night. "Just trust me." She stepped into an empty conference room and dialed. Silas answered on the second ring. "It's happening faster than I thought." Viv didn't bother with pleasantries. The vulnerability, it's worse than Tobias realized. "If you're going to do this, it has to be tonight." There was a pause on the other end. "What about Clayton? He doesn't know yet, but he will soon. We're running out of time." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "I'll need to make arrangements for June, someone to watch her while I'm working. Bring her." Viv surprised herself with the suggestion. "There are empty offices on the 32nd floor. She can do homework there." "You want me to bring my 11-year-old daughter to Cortec? I want you to show her that sometimes good people win, that sometimes the system works the way it's supposed to." The words felt presumptuous even as Viv spoke them, but she meant them. Silas was quiet for so long that Viv thought the call had dropped. Then softly, "Okay, we'll be there at 6. The hours between noon and 6 p.m. stretched like taffy. Viv fielded calls from board members, reassured nervous investors, and avoided Clayton as much as possible. She caught him twice, watching her from across the floor, his expression unreadable. He knew something was happening. He just didn't know what. At 5:45 p.m., Viv stood in the empty development room. Tobias had cleared it as requested, though his confusion had been palpable. The servers hummed quietly, their cooling fans the only sound in the cavernous space. Viv had authorized access, bypassing every security protocol that would normally prevent what was about to happen. At 5:58 p.m., her phone buzzed. "They're here." Viv took the elevator down to the lobby. Silas stood near the security desk, Juniper beside him. The girl wore a backpack almost as big as she was, her hand tight in her father's. The security guard, a different one from Silas's night shift, was regarding them with obvious confusion. "Ms. Kellerman." The guard straightened when he saw her. "These folks say they have an appointment with you?" "They do." Viv's voice carried the authority of someone who didn't expect to be questioned. "Mr. Booker is consulting on the Titan project. He'll need an access badge. Full clearance, all floors." The guard's eyebrows rose slightly, but he processed the request without comment. Cortec's CEO wanting to grant access to someone was not his concern. He handed Silas a temporary badge, then hesitated over Juniper. "The young lady too? She's with him. Guest badge is fine." They rode the elevator to the 32nd floor in silence. Juniper pressed close to her father, her eyes wide as she took in the gleaming chrome and glass, so different from the worn community center. When the doors opened, she gasped softly at the view. Chicago's skyline spreading out through floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights beginning to sparkle as dusk settled over the lake. Viv led them to the development room, Silas stopped in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the space. The servers he'd helped design, the workstations where he'd once sat as a respected colleague, the whiteboard still covered in Tobias's frustrated attempts to understand architecture that Silas had created. "June can use my office," Viv gestured down the hall. "There's a couch, Wi-Fi, whatever she needs." Silas looked down at his daughter. "You okay with that, baby girl?" Juniper nodded, but her grip on her father's hand tightened. "How long will you be?" "As long as it takes." Silas crouched to her eye level. "But I'll check on you every hour, and if you need anything, Ms. Kellerman will be right here." Viv showed Juniper to her office, setting the girl up with the Wi-Fi password and pointing out the small refrigerator stocked with drinks. When she returned to the development room, Silas had already logged into the main terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the muscle memory of someone coming home after a long absence. "Everything you need?" Viv hovered near the doorway, suddenly uncertain of her role. Silas didn't look up from the screen. "Yeah, just leave me alone to work and keep Clayton away from this floor." Viv nodded and retreated to the corridor. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Tobias. "Status update at 8 a.m. No interruptions before then." Then she settled into a chair outside the development room, a sentry guarding against interruption. At 7:15 p.m., Clayton appeared at the end of the hallway. His eyes narrowed when he saw Viv sitting there. "What's going on?" "Working on the solution I mentioned." Clayton walked closer, his gaze shifting to the closed development room door. "Who's in there?" "A consultant." "We don't have any consultants on this project." His voice hardened. "We do now." Clayton reached for the door handle. Viv stood, blocking his path. "I need to see what's happening in there." Clayton's professional mask was slipping, irritation bleeding through. "No, you don't." They stared at each other, the tension crystallizing into something sharp and dangerous. Clayton took a step back, his expression shifting to concerned mentor. "Vivienne, what are you doing? Whatever this is, you're making a mistake." "Maybe." Viv kept her voice steady. "Or maybe I'm correcting one that was made 5 years ago." Something flickered in Clayton's eyes. Recognition, then calculation. "Whatever you think you know." "I know enough. And in 48 hours, so will everyone else." Clayton's jaw tightened. He looked at the closed door, then back at Viv. "When this fails, and it will fail, the board won't be as understanding as I've been. Then I guess we'll see what happens when it doesn't fail." Clayton walked away without another word, but Viv could feel his anger radiating down the hallway like heat. She'd just declared war on her CFO, her supposed mentor, the man who held significant influence with Cortex board, and she'd done it while gambling everything on a janitor she'd known for less than 24 hours. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of coffee and anxious waiting. Viv checked on Juniper twice, the first time finding her doing homework, the second time finding her asleep on the office couch, her math textbook open beside her. Each time Viv glanced into the development room, Silas was hunched over the terminal, utterly focused, his fingers flying across the keyboard. At 3 a.m., Tobias showed up despite Viv's instruction not to. "He's fixing it, isn't he?" Tobias's voice was awed, almost reverent, as he peered through the glass partition. "Whoever that is, he actually understands the original architecture, yes." Viv didn't elaborate. Viv didn't. At 5 a.m., the development room door opened. Silas stepped out, looking exhausted but satisfied. He held a USB drive. "It's done." His voice was rough from hours of not speaking. "The vulnerability is patched. I've tested it against every attack vector I could think of. Your system is solid now." Viv took the drive with trembling hands. "This is documentation. Every change I made, every line of code I touched, explained in detail. Tobias and his team will be able to maintain it going forward." Silas met her eyes, and I embedded something else. Encrypted proof of what happened 5 years ago. The email, the evidence, everything. Anyone who knows where to look can find it. You can't erase this truth, Ms. Kellerman. It's written into the foundation now. Good. Viv's throat felt tight. Thank you doesn't seem... Don't thank me yet. Silas glanced back at the terminal. I didn't do this for gratitude, I know. You did it for June. Silas nodded slowly. I need to get her home. She has school in this morning. Of course. Viv hesitated. There's a board meeting this afternoon. After the launch, I'm going to recommend that the company formally reinstate you. Full restoration of your title, your salary, your benefits, back pay for the years you lost, everything. Silas stood very still. You think that's what I want? I thought. I assumed. You assumed I spent 5 years dreaming of getting my old job back, of walking into that corner office and pretending nothing happened. Silas shook his head. That job doesn't exist anymore, Ms. Kellerman. The man who wanted it doesn't exist either. But you deserve... I don't need a title to know who I am. His voice was quiet but firm. I knew who I was through every night I spent sleeping in a Ford Taurus with my daughter. Through every floor I mopped while people who couldn't code their way out of a paper bag walked past me like I was invisible. Through every toilet I cleaned in a building I helped design. I'm not going back to that life. Not because it was beneath me, but because I built something better. Something that matters more than any stock options or corner office. Viv thought about the children at Liberty Street, their faces lit by ancient computer screens. Liberty Street, the community center. Those kids, they're me 25, 30 years ago. Smart, hungry, and nobody's giving them a chance. The system isn't designed for people like them. Never has been. Silas's expression softened slightly. But I can change that. I can give them what nobody gave me. The tools and the confidence to build their own futures. What do you need? Silas smiled, a real smile for the first time since Viv had met him. Ask me after your launch. He went to collect Juniper, the girl still drowsy and confused as her father guided her to the elevator. Viv watched them disappear, then returned to the development room. The screen still glowed with Silas's work, lines of elegant code that would save her company while simultaneously ensuring its darkest secrets could never be fully buried. At 8 a.m., Tobias arrived with his team. Their faces transformed from skepticism to wonder as they reviewed Silas's documentation, understanding dawning as they traced through the fixes. This is brilliant. Tobias looked up at Viv, questions written across his face. Who was that consultant? Someone who understands the system better than anyone. That's all you need to know. At noon, Project Titan launched. The engineering team monitored the rollout, their faces tense with anticipation that gradually gave way to relief as the system held. No breaches, no vulnerabilities. By the end of the day, Titan was performing 15% above projections. The celebration was subdued, too much had happened for triumph, but there was relief in the air. Viv fielded congratulatory calls from board members, accepted praise from investors, and gave a brief statement to the press that said nothing about the crisis they'd barely averted. At 4 p.m., she gathered the senior leadership team in the 32nd floor conference room. Clayton sat at her right hand as always, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been quiet all day, watching and waiting. Viv stood at the head of the table. I want to tell you a story. It's not a comfortable story, and it doesn't paint this company in a good light. But you deserve to hear it. She told them about Silas Booker, about his contributions to the technology they'd all built their careers on, about the whistleblower email he'd sent, about the injustice that followed. She told them about 5 years of exile for a man whose only crime was honesty, and then she told them about Clayton. Clayton's face remained impassive, but his hands on the table had curled into fists. This is absurd. These allegations are completely unfounded. I don't know where you got this information, but from our own archives. Viv slid a folder across the table. The email you thought was deleted is still sitting on a backup server that hasn't been purged since the company was founded. You didn't cover your tracks as well as you thought you did. The room had gone absolutely silent. The other executives were staring at Clayton with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed horror. Even if this email exists, Clayton tried, it doesn't prove anything. Anyone can make allegations. Silas Booker has transaction records. Viv's voice was calm, almost gentle. Bank transfers between executives and data buyers, a complete paper trail. She paused, letting that sink in. He kept them because he knew what kind of people he was dealing with. He knew you'd try to bury him, and he was right. Clayton stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You can't do this. I've been with this company since before you were hired. I supported your promotion. You thought you could control me. Viv cut him off. You thought I'd be so grateful for your mentorship that I'd never look too closely at your secrets. You were wrong. For a long moment, Clayton said nothing. He looked around the table, searching for allies, finding none. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Viv exhaled slowly, not realizing until that moment that she'd been holding her breath. She turned to the remaining executives. Legal will be conducting a full investigation. Anyone who participated in or had knowledge of the data selling scheme will be asked to resign. This company is going to operate with integrity, or it's not going to operate at all. The meeting dissolved into stunned murmurs as executives filed out. Viv remained at the table, the weight of what she'd just done settling onto her shoulders. She'd destroyed Clayton. She'd exposed corruption that could still damage Cortex's reputation. She'd gambled everything on doing the right thing. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. June says thank you for letting her use your office. She wants to know if all CEOs have couches that comfortable. Despite everything, Viv smiled. 3 weeks after Clayton Barrett's resignation, Viv stood in Cortex atrium addressing the entire company. Hundreds of faces looked up at her from the main floor. Engineers, marketers, salespeople, security guards, janitors. The people who made the company function, most of whom had no idea how close they'd come to disaster. I want to tell you something that's been weighing on me. Her voice carried through the space, amplified by the building's acoustics. For 18 months, a man named Silas Booker worked in this building. He mopped our floors, emptied our trash, cleaned our bathrooms, and in that entire time, I never once looked at him. Never wondered who he was or what his story might be. I saw a janitor and assumed that was all there was to see. The room was utterly silent. Viv could feel the weight of their attention, the curiosity and confusion mixing in the air. When I finally did look, when I finally paid attention, it was because I suspected him of something criminal. Because my first instinct when I saw a black man in a place he wasn't supposed to be was to assume the worst. She let that land, let the discomfort of it settle into the room. I'd like to tell you I'm not that kind of person, that I don't carry those assumptions, those biases. But the truth is I do. We all do. We're products of our experiences, our culture, our unexamined beliefs. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Viv pressed on. Silas Booker wasn't a thief. He was a senior system architect who designed the core infrastructure this entire company is built on. 8 years ago, he discovered that core tech executives were illegally selling user data. He reported it through proper channels, trusting the system to protect him. Instead, our former CFO destroyed his career, blacklisted him from the industry, and forced him into poverty. For 5 years, Silas Booker, one of the most talented engineers this company has ever had, couldn't find work anywhere. He lived in his car with his 6-year-old daughter. And when he finally scraped together enough to survive, The only job available to him was mopping the floors of the building he'd helped design. Murmurs rippled through the crowd now, shock and anger mixing in equal measure. Project Titan launched successfully because Silas Booker fixed the vulnerability that was going to destroy it. He saved this company, and he did it not for recognition, not for money, but because he wanted his daughter to see that sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't end in destruction. She paused, her throat tight. Unless we're willing to confront our biases, to really examine the ways we've been taught, to see certain people as threats and others as colleagues, we'll keep making the same mistakes. We'll keep destroying good people because they don't look like what we expect. The speech continued for another 10 minutes, outlining the reforms Viv had already begun implementing. Independent termination reviews, whistleblower protections, ethics oversight. But it was that middle section that would be quoted in industry publications for months afterward, that would be dissected in business school case studies, that would haunt Viv every time she looked at herself in the mirror. After the all-hands meeting, Viv retreated to her office and found Preston Whitmore waiting. The board member sat in one of her guest chairs, his expression grave. That was quite a confession. Preston's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. It needed to be said. The board has concerns. He folded his hands in his lap, the picture of measured professionalism. You've destabilized the executive team, exposed the company to potential litigation, and publicly admitted to systemic bias. Some members are questioning whether you're the right person to lead us through this crisis. Viv had been expecting this. Am I being asked to resign? Not yet, but there will be a formal review in 30 days. Preston met her eyes. I'm here as a courtesy, Vivienne, to tell you that your position is not secure. Clayton had allies on the board, people who are very uncomfortable with how this unfolded. Clayton was selling user data illegally and retaliating against whistleblowers. Those crimes don't become acceptable because he had friends in high places. No one's saying they are. But the way you handled it, bringing in a terminated employee without board approval, conducting a vigilante investigation, exposing the company to massive PR damage, these are not the actions of a stable leader. Preston's voice softened slightly. I'm not unsympathetic to what you were trying to do, but perception matters, and right now, you look reckless. Viv leaned back in her chair, exhaustion settling into her bones. So what happens in 30 days? The board will vote on your future as CEO. Preston stood, smoothing his jacket. I'd suggest you spend that time demonstrating stability and sound judgment. Show us you can lead this company through the aftermath of what you've created. After he left, Viv sat alone in her office for a long time, staring out at Chicago's skyline. She'd done the right thing, she knew that, but doing the right thing might cost her everything she'd built. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Heard about the speech. June says you're brave. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but it took guts. Silas. Viv found herself smiling despite the knot in her stomach. She typed back, "How's Liberty Street?" The response came quickly. "Crowded. Good crowded. We're up to 40 students now. Going to need more computers soon." Viv stared at the message for a long moment, an idea forming. Then she began making calls. The investigation into Clayton Barrett concluded on a Thursday morning. Legal presented their findings in a closed session with the board. Transaction records confirmed, email evidence authenticated, 3 additional executives implicated in the cover-up. The data-selling scheme had netted Cortex leadership over $2 million over 18 months. Clayton had personally profited by nearly $600,000. The company issued a carefully worded statement. Several former executives have resigned following an internal investigation into violations of data privacy policies. Cortex is cooperating fully with federal regulators and has implemented comprehensive reforms to prevent future violations. Clayton himself disappeared. His house in Lincoln Park went up for sale. Word filtered back through industry contacts that he'd relocated to Arizona, taking a position with a small consulting firm at a fraction of his former salary. His reputation preceded him now, the whispers about what he'd done spreading faster than any press release could travel. But 3 other executives also resigned, leaving gaps in Cortec's leadership structure that Viv scrambled to fill. The company's stock price dipped 7% on the news, recovering only when Viv personally called major investors to reassure them. Federal regulators opened a formal inquiry that would drag on for months. And through it all, the board watched Viv with increasing skepticism. 2 weeks before the board review, Viv drove back to Ashland Heights. She hadn't seen Silas since the night he'd fixed Titan, though they'd exchanged occasional texts. The Mercedes felt even more obscene now, gleaming against the neighborhood's poverty like an accusation. Liberty Street Community Hub looked the same from the outside, but when Viv entered, she found the place transformed. The main room now held 20 computers instead of 8, all newer models. The walls had been repainted a cheerful yellow. New motivational posters hung beside the children's artwork, and in the back room, where Viv had first confronted Silas, there was now a small office with actual furniture. A real desk, filing cabinets, shelves loaded with programming textbooks. Silas looked up from his desk as Viv appeared in the doorway. His expression was guarded but not hostile. "Ms. Kellerman, didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to talk about Liberty Street." Viv stayed in the doorway, not presuming entry. "About what you're building here? We're doing fine. Donations have picked up since the news about Cortec broke. People like supporting the underdog." There was a hint of irony in his voice. "I want to do more than donate." Viv pulled out a folder she'd been carrying. "I want to establish a formal partnership. Cortec would provide equipment, curriculum development, mentorship from our engineers. We'd also fund expansion, more classrooms, more teachers, a pathway program that guarantees internships for your students." Silas took the folder but didn't open it. "Why?" "Because you were right. The system isn't designed for kids like yours, but it could be." She met his eyes. "I can't change what happened to you, but maybe I can help make sure it doesn't happen to them. This feels like guilt money." "Maybe it is." Viv didn't flinch from the accusation. "Does that make it less useful?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, finally opening the folder and scanning the proposal. His eyebrows rose as he read the numbers. 2.5 million over 3 years, renewable based on outcomes. "This is a lot of money, Ms. Kellerman. It's a lot of potential." Viv gestured to the main room beyond, where she could hear children's voices rising in excitement over some coding victory. "Those kids deserve the same opportunities I had, the same ones you had before Clayton took them away. And what do you get out of this? Besides a tax write-off and good PR." The question was fair. Viv had asked herself the same thing driving over here. Maybe I get to believe that systems can change, that people can be better than their worst instincts, that doing the right thing sometimes actually matters. Silas studied her face, searching for something. "You're in trouble with your board, aren't you? How did you—" "I still have friends in the industry. Word travels." His expression softened slightly. "They're going to fire you for exposing Clayton." "Maybe. Probably." Viv found herself being more honest than she'd intended. "But I'd rather be fired for doing the right thing than keep my job by staying silent." "That's easy to say when you have a safety net." Silas's voice was gentle but firm. "You'll land on your feet, Ms. Kellerman. You always will. People like me, people like these kids, we don't get second chances." "Then let's make sure they get first chances." Viv pointed to the proposal. "Real ones. Not charity, not handouts. Actual pathways to careers that value their skills regardless of their zip code or the color of their skin." Silas looked down at the folder again, then back at Viv. "I need to think about it." Talk to the community board, make sure this isn't just you assuaging your guilt before you move on to whatever comes next. Fair enough. Viv turned to leave, then stopped. For what it's worth, I meant what I said in that speech. I never saw you. And I should have. After she left, Viv sat in her car for several minutes before starting the engine. Through the window, she could see Silas talking to Juniper, the girl having appeared from somewhere in the building. They were looking at the proposal together, Silas pointing to different sections while Juniper read over his shoulder. Whatever they decided, Viv realized it would be their decision, not hers. That was as it should be. The board review took place on a gray Tuesday afternoon. Viv entered the conference room to find 12 board members seated around the table, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile. Preston Whitmore sat at the far end, his face carefully neutral. The review lasted 3 hours. They questioned every decision Viv had made. Hiring Silas without authorization, confronting Clayton publicly, admitting to systemic bias in front of the entire company. They presented data on the stock price decline, the regulatory inquiries, the reputational damage. You've destabilized this company at a critical juncture. Board member Patricia Chen's voice was sharp, accusatory. Project Titan launched successfully, yes, but at what cost? We have federal investigators examining our data practices. 3 C-level positions are vacant, and our CEO has publicly confessed to racial bias, opening us to discrimination lawsuits we haven't even imagined yet. I confess to being human. Viv kept her voice steady, to having blind spots and working to correct them. Would you prefer I'd stayed silent? Let Clayton continue covering up crimes? We would prefer you'd handled it through proper channels. Another board member, James Rodriguez, leaned forward. Brought your concerns to us first, allowed us to conduct a proper investigation, manage the PR fallout strategically. The proper channels failed 5 years ago. Viv met his eyes. Silas Booker trusted proper channels and they destroyed him. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. So you decided to play vigilante? Patricia's tone dripped disdain. To conduct your own investigation and pass judgment on executives who had been with this company far longer than you? I decided to do my job, which is to ensure this company operates with integrity. Your job is to protect shareholder value. Preston finally spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. And right now, our stock is down, our reputation is damaged, and our leadership team is in shambles. Whatever your intentions, Vivienne, the results speak for themselves. The vote was called, 8-4 in favor of Viv's removal, effective immediately. She would be allowed to resign rather than be terminated, given a generous severance package, and asked to sign a non-disparagement agreement. The decision was final. Viv walked out of Cortec for the last time at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. She'd spent the afternoon packing her office, saying quiet goodbyes to colleagues who didn't know whether to offer congratulations or condolences. Tobias had hugged her, tears in his eyes. You did the right thing. That should matter more than it does. It should. But it didn't change the fact that Viv was unemployed for the first time in her adult life. Her career in tech likely over. Her reputation now permanently marked by the word troublemaker. She drove home through rush-hour traffic, the sky darkening over Lake Michigan, and felt strangely light. She'd lost everything, and somehow, impossibly, she felt freer than she had in years. Her phone rang as she pulled into her building's parking garage, an unknown number. Viv almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Ms. Kellerman? It's Silas. I heard about the board decision. News travels fast. I told you it would. His voice was matter-of-fact, not quite sympathetic. How are you holding up? Honestly, I don't know yet. Viv leaned her head back against the seat. Ask me in a week. There was a pause. Liberty Street accepted your proposal. The community board voted unanimously this morning. We want the partnership. Despite everything, Viv smiled. That's good. That's really good. But we have conditions. Silas's tone shifted slightly. We want you involved, not just your money. You personally. Teaching, mentoring, showing up. These kids need to see that people who look like you actually care about people who look like them. I'm not exactly employed at the moment. I'll have time. That's the other condition. We want you to run the program, full-time. Salary's not great. We're a non-profit. We can't compete with tech CEO money. But it comes with actual purpose instead of board meetings and shareholder calls. Viv sat up straighter. You want me to work at Liberty Street? We want you to help us build something that lasts longer than quarterly earnings reports. Silas's voice was steady, certain. You said systems could change. Prove it. For a long moment, Viv couldn't speak. She thought about her career in tech, the corner offices, the six-figure salary, the reputation she'd built and then destroyed. She thought about the children at Liberty Street, their faces lit by computer screens, their futures still unwritten. She thought about Silas, who'd lost everything and built something better from what remained. When do I start? Monday, 8 a.m. Don't be late, the kids notice. 6 months later, Liberty Street Technology Academy occupied 3 buildings on a 2-block campus. The original community hub had been renovated with Cortex funding. New computers, modern classrooms, a dedicated server room where advanced students learned network administration. The building next door, previously abandoned, had been converted into a makerspace with 3D printers and robotics equipment. And the third building, still under construction, would house a scholarship fund office and college counseling center. Viv stood in the main classroom watching Juniper Booker teach a group of 7-year-olds basic coding concepts. The girl had grown more confident over the past months, her natural aptitude for teaching emerging as she helped younger students. She explained loops and conditionals with patience that reminded Viv of Silas, breaking complex ideas into digestible pieces. When the class ended and the children filtered out to waiting parents, Juniper approached Viv with a shy smile. Did I do okay? You were perfect. Viv meant it. Have you thought about the summer teaching assistant position? Juniper nodded eagerly. Dad says if my grades stay up, I can do it. She hesitated. Ms. Kellerman, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you give up being a CEO to work here? I mean, you made a lot more money before, right? Viv considered the question carefully. Juniper deserved honesty, not platitudes. I did make more money, but I wasn't making a difference. At Cortec, I was managing systems and shareholders. Here, I'm helping build futures. That matters more. Juniper absorbed this, her expression thoughtful beyond her years. My dad says you're brave, that it's harder to admit you were wrong than to pretend you were always right. Your dad's a smart man. He also says you're proof that good people sometimes come from unexpected places. Juniper grinned suddenly, losing the seriousness. He didn't know he was talking about someone who used to be rich, though. I thought he meant someone from a different neighborhood. Despite herself, Viv laughed. Well, I am from a different neighborhood, just a different kind of different. After Juniper left, Viv found Silas in his office, the real office now, with proper furniture and filing systems and a window that looked out over the small courtyard they'd created between buildings. He was reviewing applications for the fall semester. Demand had exploded once word spread about the program's quality and the guaranteed internship pipeline to major tech companies. They'd have to turn away more students than they accepted. We got the grant. Silas looked up as Viv entered, satisfaction evident in his expression. National Science Foundation approved the full amount, $3 million over 5 years. Viv felt something loosen in her chest. That means we can expand to the South Side campus and hire 4 more full-time teachers. Silas set down the applications. We're actually doing this, Miss Kellerman, building the thing we said we'd build. Viv settled into the chair across from his desk, no longer a child's folding chair but an actual office chair, though still slightly wobbly. You know you can call me Viv now. We've been working together for 6 months. Habit. Silas smiled slightly. You're still the former CEO who saved my career. I didn't save anything. You saved yourself. I just stopped standing in the way. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sound of children's laughter drifting through the window from the courtyard. Viv thought about how far they'd both come. Silas from homeless to architect to janitor to director of the most innovative youth tech program in Chicago. Herself from CEO to unemployed to finding purpose she'd never known existed in a corner office. I got an email from Tobias yesterday. Viv broke the silence. CoreTech wants to expand the internship program. Take 20 students next summer instead of 10. Good. They should. They owe this community more than they can ever repay. Silas's expression darkened slightly, though I noticed they haven't asked me to come back. Would you want to? No. The answer was immediate, certain. That part of my life is over. I'm not interested in rebuilding what I lost. I'm interested in building something new. Viv understood that better than she could articulate. She didn't miss CoreTech, didn't miss the board meetings or the shareholder calls or the constant pressure to prioritize profit over principle. She missed the salary sometimes when her rent came due and she had to budget carefully. But she didn't miss the person she'd been, so focused on climbing that she'd forgotten to look at the people beneath her. June asked me today why I gave up being CEO. Viv watched Silas's reaction carefully. I told her it's because this matters more. What did she say? That you told her I'm proof good people come from unexpected places. Viv paused. She thought you meant someone from a different neighborhood. Silas laughed, a real laugh that transformed his face. Well, you are. Just took me a while to see it. The gala was Viv's idea, though she'd fought herself on it for weeks before proposing it to the Liberty Street board. A fundraiser, black tie, held at one of Chicago's upscale hotels, bringing together tech industry leaders and community advocates to celebrate the program's success and secure its future. Silas had been skeptical. Why court the same people who'd failed these kids in the first place? But the numbers didn't lie. They needed sustainable funding beyond grants and donations. They needed corporate partnerships that went deeper than tax-deductible charity. The event took place on a Saturday evening in early November. Viv wore a dress she'd bought during her CEO days, tailored and expensive, feeling strange after months of jeans and sweatshirts. She stood near the entrance greeting guests, tech executives she'd once called colleagues, venture capitalists who'd funded CoreTech, nonprofit leaders she'd met through this work. Tobias arrived with several CoreTech engineers, all of whom hugged Viv warmly. The new CEO sends her regards. Tobias handed over an envelope. She wanted to contribute to the scholarship fund personally. Viv opened it to find a check for $50,000. Tell her thank you. I will. Tobias lowered his voice. Between you and me, she's terrified of the job. Says she's not sure she can fill your shoes. Tell her shoes are overrated. Just do the right thing when it counts. As the ballroom filled, Viv noticed Silas enter with Juniper. The girl wore a blue dress and her best glasses, clearly nervous in the formal setting. Silas had opted for the same suit he'd worn to the CoreTech confrontation, still worn but dignified. They moved through the crowd with visible discomfort, drawing stares from guests who'd never expected to see a community center director and his preteen daughter at an event like this. Viv intercepted them before the awkwardness could deepen. You made it. Barely. Silas's smile was tight. June almost backed out 3 times. There's a lot of white people in fancy clothes. Juniper's observation was matter-of-fact, not quite accusatory. It's weird. It is weird. Viv crouched slightly to Juniper's eye level. But you know what? Half these people are here because of you. Because they heard about a sixth grader who's teaching coding to 7-year-olds and they want to be part of that story. Juniper's eyes widened. Really? Really, you're kind of famous. The evening progressed with speeches and presentations. Viv stood at the podium and told Liberty Street's story. The 40 students who'd become 80, then 120, the 97% college acceptance rate, the partnerships with major tech companies. She introduced Silas, who spoke briefly about second chances and the importance of investing in communities that traditional systems ignored. But the moment that silenced the room came when Juniper took the microphone. She hadn't been scheduled to speak. Silas had added her to the program at the last minute, wanting these corporate leaders to hear directly from the students they were supporting. My name is Juniper Booker and I'm 11 years old. Her voice was small at first, nervous, but it grew stronger as she continued. When I was 6, my dad and I lived in a car for 2 months. I didn't understand why. I just knew that everything had changed and nothing made sense anymore. I asked my dad every night when we were going home and he would tell me soon. He was lying because he didn't know if we'd ever have a home again. The ballroom was utterly silent. Viv could see faces in the crowd shifting from polite attention to genuine engagement, to discomfort, to something that might have been shame. My dad taught me that the computer only does what you tell it to do. That if something doesn't work, you don't give up, you just try a different way. He taught me that at Liberty Street in a building that was falling apart on computers that were older than I was, and now I teach other kids the same thing. Not because I'm special, but because someone gave my dad a second chance. And he used that chance to build something that gives other people first chances. Juniper looked directly at Viv, then at Silas, then back to the crowd. People think coding is about computers, but it's really about believing that you can build something new, that you don't have to accept the world the way it is, that if the system doesn't work, you can write a better one. She paused, gathering courage for her final words. My dad did that. Ms. Kellerman did that. And now we're teaching 120 kids to do the same thing. That's worth more than any salary or title or corner office. That's building something that lasts. The applause started slowly, then built to something thunderous. Viv felt tears on her face and didn't bother wiping them away. Across the room, Silas stood with his arm around his daughter, his expression a mixture of pride and profound emotion. The fundraiser exceeded its goal by 40%. Commitments totaled nearly $4 million, enough to fund Liberty Street's expansion for the next 3 years and establish a permanent endowment. As guests filtered out and the event staff began breaking down tables, Viv found herself on the hotel's balcony overlooking Chicago's skyline. Silas joined her, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. Thought you might want this. Viv took the glass gratefully. Your daughter is extraordinary. She gets that from her mother. Silas's voice was soft. Keisha had fire. Still does, probably, wherever she is now. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city lights sparkle against the darkness. I've been thinking about what June said. Viv turned to face him. About building systems that work instead of accepting broken ones. It's a good philosophy. I spent 20 years trying to succeed within a system I knew was broken. Climbed the ladder, made the compromises, told myself I'd fix things once I had power. She paused. Then I got power and realized the system doesn't want to be fixed. It wants to be maintained. So you burned it down. Silas's tone held no judgment, just observation. I exposed it. There's a difference. Viv looked at her former company's building, visible in the distance. Cortex still exists. It's still making money. But maybe it's slightly better than it was. Maybe the next whistleblower won't be destroyed. And if they are, then someone else will have to make the choice I made. Viv met his eyes. I can't fix everything, but I can fix this one thing. This program, these kids, that has to be enough. It's more than enough. Silas raised his glass. To second chances, to first chances, Viv corrected gently. They clinked glasses as Chicago sparkled beneath them, a city of broken systems and stubborn hope, of people who kept building despite every reason to quit. 3 years after the gala, Liberty Street Technology Academy had campuses in 4 Chicago neighborhoods and a waiting list that stretched into the thousands. Juniper Booker, now 14, ran the peer mentorship program while maintaining a 4.0 GPA and coding applications that had caught the attention of university recruiters. Silas had been profiled in Wired magazine as one of the most innovative educators in America, and Viv had finally stopped introducing herself as a former CEO, claiming instead the title that mattered more. Director of Strategic Partnerships at an organization that was changing lives one line of code at a time. On a Thursday afternoon in late spring, Viv received an unexpected visitor. Patricia Chen, the board member who'd voted most vocally for her removal from Cortec, stood in Liberty Street's modest lobby looking thoroughly out of place. "Miss Kellerman." Patricia's tone was professional but not warm. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Not at all. Viv led her to the small conference room they'd carved out of what used to be a storage closet. "What can I do for you?" Patricia settled into a chair, her designer suit contrasting sharply with the room's thrift store furniture. "I'm here on behalf of Cortec's board. We've been following Liberty Street's success. It's impressive what you've built." "Thank you." Viv waited, sensing this was preamble to something larger. "We'd like you to come back." Patricia's words came quickly as if she'd rehearsed them. "As CEO, the current leadership has been adequate, but the company lacks vision. We've lost our innovative edge. The board believes you could restore it." Viv stared at her, genuinely shocked. "You fired me. We asked you to resign. There's a difference." Patricia's expression was difficult to read, and in hindsight, several board members, myself included, believe we made a mistake. "You did the right thing with Clayton. The way you did it was unorthodox, but the outcome speaks for itself. Cortec is more profitable now than it was under his leadership, and our reputation has recovered. So you want me back because I'm profitable? We want you back because you have integrity." Patricia leaned forward. "That's rarer than you might think in our industry. We're prepared to offer full reinstatement, salary increase, and a formal apology for how we handled your departure." For a long moment, Viv said nothing. She thought about what returning would mean, the salary, the power, the platform to make changes at a much larger scale. She thought about the corner office and the board meetings and the pressure to prioritize shareholders over students. "I appreciate the offer." Viv's voice was steady. "But I'm going to decline." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "May I ask why?" "Because I'm exactly where I need to be." Viv gestured toward the window where she could see students filing into the afternoon coding session. 3 years ago, I would have jumped at this opportunity. I would have seen it as validation, proof that I'd been right all along. But I don't need that validation anymore. I know what I'm building here matters, and I'm not interested in walking away from it for a corner office and a bigger paycheck. We could make Liberty Street part of the offer. Corporate sponsorship, expanded funding? No. Viv's tone was firm but not unkind. Liberty Street isn't a bargaining chip. It's not a pet project or a PR opportunity. It's a community institution that exists independent of corporate interests. The moment we tie it to Cortec's business objectives, we compromise its mission. Patricia sat back, reassessing. "You've changed." "I hope so." Viv smiled slightly. "The person you fired 3 years ago needed to change." After Patricia left, Viv found Silas in his office. He looked up from the grant proposal he was reviewing. "You look like something happened. Cortec offered me my old job back." Viv settled into her usual chair. "CEO position, full reinstatement, the works." Silas set down his pen carefully. "And you said?" "No, just like that?" "Just like that." Viv met his eyes. I meant what I said at the gala. This matters more. They sat in comfortable silence, years of shared work and mutual respect requiring no additional words. Outside, children's voices rose in excitement over some small victory. A program that finally ran correctly, a concept that finally made sense, a future that suddenly seemed possible. That evening, Viv stayed late to help Juniper prepare for a coding competition. The girl was creating an application to help homeless families find shelter resources, inspired by her own experience years earlier. The code was elegant, efficient, solving a real problem with practical grace. "You're going to win this." Viv watched over Juniper's shoulder as she debugged a particularly tricky function. "Maybe." Juniper's focus never wavered from the screen. "But that's not really why I'm doing it." No, I'm doing it because someone needs to build this. Someone needs to make the system work better for people like my dad and me." She paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "You know what he told me once? That good code doesn't just work. Good code changes lives." Viv felt something tighten in her chest. Recognition of words that had traveled from Silas to Juniper to 120 students who would carry them forward into careers and communities that desperately needed people who believed systems could be better. "Your dad's right, as usual." Juniper grinned, returning to her code. He usually is, even when it's annoying. That night, driving home through Chicago's streets, Viv thought about the journey that had brought her here. From CEO to unemployed, to finding purpose she'd never imagined in a community center in Ashland Heights. She thought about Clayton Barrett, whose crimes had been her doorway to understanding her own complicity in broken systems. She thought about Silas, who'd lost everything and built something better from what remained. And she thought about the choice she'd made that night in her office, staring at security footage of a janitor who coded like an architect. The choice to investigate instead of report, to understand instead of assume, to see a person instead of a threat. Some victories aren't about reclaiming what you lost. The thought crystallized as Viv pulled into her building's parking garage. They're about building something better from what remains. Her phone buzzed with a text from Silas. "June got her application working. Thanks for staying late." Viv smiled, typing back, "That's what partners do." The response came quickly. "Is that what we are?" Viv considered the question. All it implied, all it offered, all the ways their relationship had evolved from CEO and janitor to colleagues to something deeper and more complicated. She thought about the careful distance they'd maintained, professional boundaries that had slowly blurred over 3 years of shared purpose. She typed, "I think we're whatever we decide to build, one line of code at a time." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, then, "I can work with that." Viv sat in her car for a long moment, Chicago's lights spreading out before her like code waiting to be written, like systems waiting to be changed, like futures waiting to be built by people brave enough to try.